Ever feel like you're just one step behind?
Yeah.
Like trying to catch up to a runaway train?
Yeah, definitely.
That's kind of what navigating the 2008 financial crisis felt like, at least according to Timothy Geithner.
Right.
And he would know, right? I mean, he was leading the New York Fed smack dab in the middle of it all.
Yeah.
So today's deep dive takes us into his book, Stress Test,
Okay.
to really understand not just the decisions that were made, but the atmosphere, the pressure cooker environment where those choices, had to be made.
Yeah. What's so fascinating is how Geithner just lays it all out there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he doesn't shy away from the fact that he came from a pretty unconventional background. He says, I wasn't a banker, an economist, a politician, or even a Democrat. And this is the guy walking into the situation with, like, the weight of the world on his shoulders.
Yeah.
And on top of that, he's got to deal with this perception of being an outsider.
Totally. So it makes you wonder how much his past experiences actually influence those critical early decisions.
Right? Absolutely.
And he doesn't waste any time, right? Like, right off the bat, he's upfront about the fact that he spent that year before the crisis designing what he calls spectacularly unpopular rescues of financial firms.
Oh, wow.
You can practically hear those alarm bells just blaring.
I know, right?
So walk me through that initial period, those first few months of 2009. What was the biggest problem? What kept Geithner up all night?
It wasn't just one single firm. It was more like a domino effect.
Right.
Geithner actually calls out 5 major institutions as bombs, just ready to explode.
Oh, wow.
So take AIG, for instance. Now, this wasn't just some big insurance company, right? I mean, they were woven into the fabric of the entire global financial system.
Yeah.
If they went down, it would have been like pulling on a loose thread and watching the entire thing unravel.
Oh, wow.
Like, we're talking about shockwaves that would have been felt way beyond Wall Street.
So, okay, you've got these institutions teetering on the edge, and that fear, that panic is palpable. Everyone can feel it.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have this massive public outcry against bailouts.
Of course.
So how did Geithner even begin to balance those competing pressures, especially right out of the gate?
It was a tightrope walk, and honestly, he stumbled early on. He actually talks about this one speech he gave. I mean, he completely misread the room. He says, and this is a direct quote, I somehow managed to convince the public we'd be overly generous to Wall Street while convincing the markets we wouldn't be generous enough.
Wow.
Talk about a no-win situation.
It's incredible how one misstep, one communication breakdown can have such massive ripple effects in that kind of environment.
Absolutely.
So you've got this growing panic, the public is on edge, and then countrywide financial starts to wobble.
Right.
What was it about their situation that sent up such a red flag?
Well, Countrywide was like the canary in the coal mine,
Right.
They were completely dependent on short-term loans to keep the lights on. When those dried up, it exposed this fundamental flaw in the entire system. Suddenly, even the assets considered rock solid, low risk, they were basically toxic. Geithner even quotes a banker in his book who says, Bonemon's concern over a portfolio dominated by treasuries was the classic definition of a panic.
Wow.
If people are freaking out about treasuries, things are bad.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought, because then you start to realize just how fragile a system built on trust really is.
Totally.
And of course, that brings us to the Lehman weekend.
Right.
This is where the story really takes off. Paint a picture for me. What was the mood like at the New York Fed?
Tense. Oh, Geithner doesn't sugarcoat it at all.
I bet.
They were looking into the abyss. They knew that if Lehman Brothers went down, it could set off a chain reaction, a meltdown. That weekend, it was all hands on deck, trying to find a buyer for Lehman, exploring literally every single option to avoid a total disaster. But what really highlights how impossible their situation was this debate over moral hazard.
That's a term we hear a lot, but I think it's often misunderstood.
Right.
Can you break it down for us? What does moral hazard mean in this specific context, and why was it such a sticking point?
Okay, so imagine this, right? You're a kid who knows they can get away with anything because, well, mom and dad will always bail you out.
Okay.
That's moral hazard in a nutshell.
Okay, I see it.
So, in the middle of this financial crisis, bailing out Lehman, it would have sent a message, a really bad one.
What message?
That these institutions, they could take reckless risks without consequence because, hey, the government's going to swoop in and save the day.
Right.
Every time.
Yeah. So they're stuck with this impossible choice. Save Lehman. Risk encouraging more reckless behavior down the line.
Exactly.
Or let them fail and potentially trigger a domino effect that could take down the entire global financial system.
Right.
Talk about a rock in a hard place.
Right.
And the weight of that decision, with the whole world watching, it's hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. And it wasn't just Lehman either.
Right.
Right on the heels of that decision, you've got AIG.
Oh, boy.
And they were even bigger, with the potential to, cause complete global chaos if they went down.
Wow.
Geithner's catching heat for intervening with other firms, but with AIG.
Yeah.
He's even more willing to take those risks. Public backlash be damned, He's realizing that preventing total collapse might mean making some enemies along the way.
It really gives you a whole new perspective on the position those guys are in.
Yeah.
Having to make these massive decisions, knowing there's no real win, just the least bad option.
Exactly.
So they managed to stabilize AIG, at least for the moment. How do they even start to get a handle on this runaway train?
Stress tests.
Stress tests.
That was the answer. Bold move, almost like desperate.
Right.
Basically, they forced the major banks to come clean, open the books, show us the losses, tell us exactly how much you need to stay afloat.
Oh, wow.
Geithner knew it was risky, could have blown up in their faces.
Yeah.
But the other option, that constant uncertainty, probably worse. Transparency, even if it hurts, that was the priority.
Like ripping off a Band-Aid.
Exactly.
Hurts like hell in the moment, but you got to do it to heal. They didn't stop there, though. Geithner rolls out what we now call the Geithner put, essentially setting a floor under those bank stock prices.
Yeah, that was huge. Not a lot of people know about that one.
Really?
It was critical, though. By guaranteeing a minimum stock price, he's trying to lure in private investment.
Which they desperately needed.
Exactly. But it was a gamble, right? The hope was that projecting confidence would eventually create actual confidence.
So they're writing the rules as they go along, just trying to stay one step ahead of disaster. But all this intervention, even if it was necessary, there had to be a cost. How did people react to these bailouts?
Oh.
To this idea that Wall Street was getting a life raft and Main Street was left to sink?
Fury, outrage, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
You can't talk about this without talking about the AIG bonus scandal. Executives raking in these huge bonuses after being bailed out. PR nightmare.
Total disaster.
Geithner actually writes about calling up the AIG CEO.
Oh, no.
He's just beside himself, right? He says to him, "What the F?"
Wow.
It just shows you that gap between what they felt they had to do and how it looked to everyday people.
People who are just trying to hold on to their homes, their jobs.
Exactly.
It reminds you that economics, it's not just numbers.
Yep.
It's people's lives. Easy to forget in the middle of a crisis like that.
Yeah.
So public trust is at an all-time low. The political fallout is intense. How do they even begin to put the pieces back together?
Well, first things first, got to get Congress on board.
Right.
And that's where TARP comes in.
It's a troubled asset relief program.
Right. Met with a lot of resistance at first.
Understandably.
Oh, absolutely. Geithner says Paulson's initial proposal, with that unreviewable language, intentionally aggressive. They needed to move fast, make decisions without getting bogged down.
Essentially, they're asking for a blank check.
Pretty much.
Tough sell under any circumstance.
Especially during a meltdown.
So what was TARP all about? What was in it, and how was it supposed to, right the ship?
Okay, so TARP, it was designed to pump money, liquidity into the system. Give the banks enough capital to keep those loans flowing.
Okay.
Obviously controversial. We're talking trillions of dollars. Geithner argues, though, unpopular as it was the only thing that prevented a total collapse.
So they've got TARP, but the markets are still a roller coaster. What else are they doing to try to stabilize things?
One of the biggest moves. Guaranteeing bank deposits. Even that wasn't universally popular, even within the administration.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Big debates about the potential cost. Geithner's arguing, though, that guaranteeing those deposits, even if it was expensive up front, it was the only way to stop a run on the banks.
Which would have been catastrophic.
Exactly.
So they're essentially saying, look, your money's safe, don't panic.
Right. Trying to project that sense of calm that the system was sound.
But even with TARP and the deposit guarantees, they still had WAMU.
Yeah, Washington Mutual. Big one.
What lessons did Geithner learn from that? How did it change his thinking going forward?
I think the collapse of WAMU, it really drove home just how vulnerable the system was, even with the government stepping in. He talks about this clash he had with Sheila Bair.
Head of the FDIC.
Right. It was about imposing haircuts on WAMU's creditors.
Haircuts.
Yeah, basically forcing those creditors to accept less than they were owed.
A haircut for the big guys. to try and soften the blow for everyone else.
Exactly. Bear was all for it, minimize the losses for the FDIC.
Makes sense.
Geithner pushed back hard, though. He thought that doing that to an institution as big as WAMU, it would send shockwaves through the entire system.
Yeah, I can see that.
Completely erode whatever confidence was left. He felt strongly that protecting those creditors, even the big ones, was the only way to avoid a total meltdown.
Interesting. So he's thinking long-term.
Right. Believing that restoring confidence, stability, it would be less costly in the long run than punishing everyone who took a risk.
So they let WAMU go down. No haircuts for those big creditors.
Yeah.
Markets did not like that.
Nope. Sent a pretty clear message about how shaky things still were.
Everything's connected.
Oh, absolutely.
But in the middle of all this, how'd they start to actually turn things around? Pull the financial system back from the edge?
Tough to say it was any one thing. Combination factors, probably.
Okay.
Those stress tests, yeah, they were rough in the short term, but they forced the banks to, face reality, raise the capital they needed.
Right.
And the Geithner put, controversial as it was, it gave the markets something to hold on to.
Right.
But honestly, the sheer size of the government response, as unpopular as it was, that sent a message too.
What message?
That they were serious about doing whatever it took.
To prevent a total collapse.
Exactly.
It's interesting how Geithner looks back on that time.
Yeah.
He doesn't downplay the anger.
Yeah.
The whole bailing out Wall Street thing. But he maintains that given what they knew at the time, they made the best possible calls.
And in fairness, the U.S. economy did recover. Slowly, unevenly, but it did bounce back.
It did.
The financial system stabilized, those emergency programs phased out eventually. Geithner actually points out that compared to a lot of other countries facing similar crises, the U.S., we did all right.
Better than some, yeah.
Especially in Europe.
He seems pretty proud of the fact that those TARP investments, they ended up making money for taxpayers.
Oh, yeah, but not exactly the headline at the time, was it?
Not quite.
Back then, it was all bailouts and no accountability.
Yeah.
But Geithner insists those programs, they were designed to minimize losses, encourage private investment. A necessary evil, sure, but temporary.
Right.
Not a long-term fix.
Which brings us to Dodd-Frank. Huge financial reform bill came out of the crisis.
Right.
Geithner was heavily involved with that. What was the goal there? And how effective has it been in actually preventing another meltdown?
Well, Dodd-Frank was basically trying to fix the things that went wrong, the weaknesses that caused the crisis in the first place. Stricter rules for banks, especially around how much capital they need to hold, the kinds of risks they can take.
Right.
They created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That was new, designed to protect people from predatory lending practices.
Right, yeah.
And then trying to bring some transparency to derivatives, those complex financial instruments that played such a big role in all of this.
Sounds like they threw the whole rule book out and started over.
Pretty much.
But did it work? Have we seen another crisis like 2008 since Dodd-Frank was passed?
Knock on wood, but not yet. Doesn't mean it can't happen again, though. The financial system, it's a beast. Always changing. New technologies, new players, new risks popping up all the time. Dodd-Frank was a huge step in the right direction, no doubt. More stable, more resilient.
But not foolproof.
Exactly.
So looking back on 2008 through the lens of Geithner's experience, what are the big takeaways? The lessons learned that we should be carrying with us today?
Foresight. Preparation. Those are huge.
Okay.
The crisis exposed these fundamental flaws in the system, flaws that have been there all along, but nobody paid attention to.
Right, until it's too late.
We have to be paying attention, constantly looking for those risks,
Right.
Adapting the rules to keep up.
It's also a good reminder, I think, that economics, it's not just some theoretical thing. It's people's lives. Those decisions made during the crisis, the good ones, the bad ones, they had a real impact. Not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
100%. And
Yeah.
honestly, I think Geithner's story really underscores the importance of leadership.
Okay.
Having people in those positions of power who can make tough calls, unpopular calls, when it matters most.
When the pressure's on. Well, that was intense.
To say the least.
We covered it all, from those early days of panic to the scramble to keep everything from falling apart, the public outrage, the political fallout, the long road back.
It's a lot, but it just goes to show you, even in the middle of all that chaos, when it feels like the world's ending,
Right.
there are people working behind the scenes.
Trying to hold it all together.
Exactly.
Leaves you with a lot to think about.
It really does.
Before we wrap up, one last thing for our listeners to ponder. Geithner, he focuses mainly on the banks, right? The
Right.
too big to fail institutions.
Yeah.
But what about everyone else? What about the parts of the financial system that were operating in the shadows, outside the usual rules?
Interesting.
How'd the crisis impact them? And what would a similar response even look like today in a world of fintech, crypto, decentralized finance? Just something to consider as we navigate this whole new world of 21st century finance.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. That's what makes these deep dives so interesting.
That's the truth. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.